Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, old and new friends of FFI. I feel very privileged tonight that I can speak about Burma, because as Mark has kindly introduced, I feel very passionate about this country and try to engage very early on when there were difficult times to visit this country. As you all remember, even until a few years ago, it was only possible to visit as a tourist for 2 weeks. The country was under military rule. People were suffering in poverty and human rights violation. And it was not really visible that this country could emerge from those days into a brighter future. Now, therefore, I've chosen this title as a sort of lost kingdom, not just in terms of nature, but also in terms of biodiversity. It's a place that has been rarely visited by conservation scientists, biologists, anthropologists alike. So over 30 years, there has been very little, with few exceptions, research done in Myanmar. Only WCS has been there a little longer in Myanmar doing work in that country. And so I was very eager to go, as Mark said, and have a look. And I was, of course, mesmerized by the flagship species that occur there, such as this red panda. It's one of the most beautiful species in the eastern Himalayas that range from Nepal all the way to Sichuan. And nobody knew what the population of this species, for example, would be in Myanmar, because no work had been done in this place. And a few years ago, of course, suddenly the situation had changed. We know that since 1998, we had very dark days when the opposition leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, the founder of General Aung San, who declared independence from Britain many years ago, was imprisoned after the election win and remained in house arrest for most of the years later. Nevertheless, became the light of hope for many people, received the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago, and is probably, many people would argue, but subject to the sanctions, that finally the old regime changed. The old guard stepped down, they drew up a new constitution and allowed for an election that had secured seats for the military in the parliament. 30% are blocked for the military. And I know the system very well because a copy of the Indonesian system under Suharto, where I have lived and worked for a long time, which is sort of called guided democracy. So it was a top-down reform process where the society and the political system was to change, but without a revolution and without great violence. Luckily enough, this happens. And today we have a place that is just tremendously more free. It's by far not perfect. There's a lot of problems still there. And you've heard about the serious issues with the Rohingya, with the Muslim minorities in the southwest of the country, and many unresolved problems, both in terms of human rights and progress towards democracy. But there's tremendous things that have happened. 2 years ago, probably Myanmar was the most freest country in terms of the freedom of press. Nobody had ever anticipated that. Now, some of the rights have been taken back again, but it still enjoys much more freedom of press than, for example, Vietnam, Cambodia, or Thailand, which has turned into a military dictatorship recently. And so FFI has had quite a special relationship with countries that come out of a crisis. And it provides not just constraints and challenges, but also extraordinary opportunities for conservation. We had the situation post-Civil War in Liberia, where FFI stepped in directly after the Civil War to create a conservation program. We have done this after the natural disaster in Aceh and the Aceh autonomy movement in Indonesia, and also after the coup of Hun Sen and the basically end of the Khmer Rouge rule in Cambodia. In those few days, or even, you have a window of opportunity of like 3-4 years before major vested interests take hold of what is left of biodiversity. A lot of areas that were in situations of war were actually preserved for wildlife because nobody entered those forests. The same is the case in Myanmar. There is vast areas of forest, especially along the borders of Myanmar, where for many years wildlife has continued to thrive despite civil unrest, ethnic conflicts, and war by the government against its people. So we have this amazing situation. And even in the middle of Europe, this is happening. I'm half Slovenian, half German, but I come from West Germany, having experienced this 2 years where the German Minister of Environment under the sort of democratic reform government, and that 1 year before East Germany be reunited with West Germany, declared 20% of East Germany a biosphere reserve. So this moment of history, you only get once. And this is what is happening in Myanmar right now. Myanmar has very few protected areas. Only 6% of the entire forests are protected. Many species still are to be discovered. It's one of the biodiverse richest countries in Southeast Asia. And we have these few years to really get conservation going in this country. And that's why I sort of pushed Mark for FFI to take a step and work in this country. And even if we have democratization, we still have other major remaining problems that pose also both challenges and opportunities for conservation. Most of, you can say actually almost 40% until a few years ago of Myanmar was controlled by ethnic insurgent armies. This is the KNU, the Karen National Union, in one of the areas where we are working. Most of these groups have by now signed ceasefire agreements with the government. A few have negotiated peace agreements, but some still are in active war, especially in the north. The Kachin Independence Army, the Northern Shan State Army still have an active conflict with the government. So even if Aung San Suu Kyi in the upcoming election at the end of the year, which is promised to be fair and free, we will have to watch this, of course, and see what is happening, but international observers are convinced that there will be an almost free election, and so there's a great chance of the opposition to win the next election. But this will not go away. This will be a constant challenge, how to build peace with all these armed groups throughout the country. Now you can see this country spans, it's actually about 2,500 kilometers from the very far north to the very far south. It starts in the Himalayas, bordering the Tibetan Autonomous Region in China and Yunnan province, India, then Laos, Thailand to the east, and Bangladesh to the west. Ecosystems range from icy mountains in the north, alpine meadows, temperate forests, to the dry zone with deciduous forest and dry scrub, all the way down to mangroves in the Irrawaddy Delta, one of the largest undammed rivers in Asia, with an intact fish fauna still at this stage, to an incredibly rich coastline with coral reefs, the Myek Archipelago, which has hundreds of islands, most named after distinguished lords and ladies of the British Empire before. We are still in search of the individuals, whether we can place a name to some of the heirs of these families. Who knows, maybe they want to adopt a coral reef on one of these islands in the archipelago. And then in the very far south, a very unique rainforest that isn't quite Sundaik yet, because it has a short dry season, so it's not the complete evergreen rainforest that we have in Malaysia. You have then the Peninsula Malaysia coming in the very south down here, but this sort of, you see this, everything that is red are key biodiversity areas, the most important priority sites in Myanmar, and you see this is all red and this is all red. So this is where the really important conservation tasks lie. And this transitional forest has a high level of endemism, as well as the only kind of level lowland rainforest left on mainland Southeast Asia of this kind. In Thailand, it existed before. It has been completely destroyed. I will talk about some of these project sites. We are in some of these priority regions that are very important for conservation. But it started all very small. When Mark asked me to take a peek, we had a lot of very small but very successful in terms of conservation projects in Indochina, which were focusing on primate conservation, bringing species back from the brink of extinction. And nobody knew anything about primates, so with our experience and background, maybe there would be something that we could look at with a small species conservation program first. So that's what I did. We organized some expeditions to look for primates. Among those, one endangered species, which is the eastern hoolock gibbon. We have the western hoolock gibbon, sorry. There's two species that look almost identically, and even I get mixed up because one has a very narrow eyebrow and the other one has a very thick white eyebrow. But essentially, it's a hoolock gibbon. And so we were looking for these, and obviously, I was very excited by some of the old literature that I read. There was a great British botanist that walked through the northern Himalayas, Frank Kingdon Ward, during World War II. retreating from the Chinese and Japanese troops when, in the midst of heavy fighting, collecting plants, and then basically because he missed the last sort of troop that went westward to India, he then walked back home through the northern Himalayas of Burma to northern India. And so he first described this mountain range, the Immobom mountain range, as being one of the most important centers for plant diversity on the planet. And it's indeed a very rich area, very high rainfall, cloud forests reaching up to snow-capped mountains. And of course, rhododendron is one of the groups that is extremely diverse in this area. We have more than, I think, 25 species of rhododendron there, but it's still, in this mountain range, still not well researched. The mountains basically also have a slope into Yunnan, where some more work has been done, and some of these rhododendron species have been well documented. Of course, in the upper altitude, we got some alpine meadows. Then we have first this conifer forest coming with fir trees, and this is actually a little bit lower down. You will see bamboo in the undergrowth under the firs. That's where the red panda then sort of comes in and their habitat, who live off the young bamboo leaves and shoots. And then you have cloud forest, rich, broadleaf, temperate broadleaf forest with tree trunks covered in dense moss. And also likewise here, we have a very rich flora and a lot of species of orchids that are endemic to this mountain range. Endemism comes because you actually have in this far north of Burma, these mountain ridges at the edge of the eastern part of the Himalayas are bisected by a very large river. You have the Irrawaddy River there, and basically the next river is the Mekong River. So this mountain range is wedged between the Irrawaddy and the Mekong, which effectively stops species movement, and that's why we have speciation and we have had evolution and endemism developing in this mountain range. So different from beyond, further east of the Mekong or further west of the Irrawaddy. It has distinct fauna and flora. And so we made an absolutely unusual discovery. Only very rarely in recent history it's possible to find a new primate species to science. In 2010, we come across a local law hunter who had hunted this animal. This is the Myanmar snub-nosed monkey, a very large monkey of a group of monkeys that FFI has been working on already in Vietnam and China. And it was a great discovery, very privileged. We were so excited about finding the specimen, and then this is the holotype that you see here that is now in the Museum of Zurich in Switzerland. We have done both the DNA work as well as the classic taxonomic description and described it as a new species to science. And it's extremely elusive. So the next question would, of course, we all wanted to see the species in the wild, but months and months through really difficult forests, covered in snow, there was no chance to ever see it. And the local hunters are saying, well, wrong season. You come in the dry season when it's sunny. You should come in the rainy season. Then, of course, this area, no road access, nothing. You would have to walk 2 weeks on foot to get to the outskirts of this area. And so why? Well, that's when we hunt them because they're very noisy in the forest. I said, why? What sort of noise? Well, they sneeze in the rain. And so it's a snub-nosed monkeys, right, with an upturned nose. And so apparently the hunters are saying the water is dropping into the nose and makes them sneeze. And that's how they unfortunately get shot. This area is inhabited by Lisu tribes. They speak a Tibeto-Burman language. People that still live off subsistence hunting. And when we came there first, this area was closed off to the outside world. Unfortunately, this has changed, and I will come to that in a minute. But because it's so elusive, and we know the similar species, the Yunnan snub-nosed monkey, the snub-nosed monkey in Sichuan, and the Tonkin snub-nosed monkey in Vietnam, that actually this is not a largely arboreal primate, so a primate that lives on the trees, but spends a lot of time on the ground. So we then tried camel trapping. And there you go. This is the first ever photo of a Myanmar snub-nosed monkey in the wild. Not very beautiful, but one could say it's a rather ugly monkey, but rare and special. And so in better colors, it looks like this. This is a recent specimen, a recent species that was caught alive on the Chinese Burmese border to go into wildlife trade, unfortunately. And this primate, of course, newly discovered, was immediately listed as critically endangered on the IUCN Red List, because after the intensive camera trap studies, and we finally also actually videoed them in the wild, it was clear that there is less than 3 large groups of these snub-nosed monkeys, and the total population is probably less than 300, the global population. So it's critically endangered, requires immediate attention, and it was threatened by hunting, by very skilled hunters. Not only this species, of course, was quite impressive, but the camera trapping that I showed you brought up all sorts of species, mammals such as this takin, a typical Himalayan species of these high mountain forests, rare pheasants such as Slatus monai, for example, absolutely fascinating array of Himalayan species, and of course red pandas, as I started out of at the beginning of the talk. And this area was largely untouched. So the only threat at that time when we first came in 2010 was hunting. But then a major hydroelectric power project started. This is China Power Investment. It's a series of 8 dams on the 2 tributaries of the Irrawaddy, the Mekha and the Malika, together having a larger power production than the Three Gorges Dam. So this was the largest hydroelectric power project in the world. Luckily, the new reform cabinet, because there was quite a lot of sentiment against those dams among the Kachin population, which is an ethnic minority, and very political and having an insurgent army. So the government actually responded and put that project on hold. A multi-billion-dollar investment was put on hold. And that has been placed on a 5-year moratorium that comes to an end next year, so exactly for the period of the current government. So we will see what comes next. We are talking to that company in terms of environmental safeguards, and if this project ever goes ahead, what needs to be done, because even this is just actually the smallest dam, which only is supposed to generate power for the large dam projects. This small dam was completed, and it's just done to generate power to supply the construction of the larger dams that would be built. But it has led to a lot of road construction in this remote area. I mean, when I first went there myself at the end of 2009, it took us 1 week on very difficult roads by car. Then we walked for 5 days, so it took us almost 2 weeks to get into the snub-nosed monkey range. When this small dam was constructed and the infrastructure associated with it was built, it was able to reach the edge of this forest in 3 days' drive, and then the walking subsequently was only 2 days. So within 5 days, you could reach it. You had, of course, a lot of influx of Chinese workers. Logging companies from China followed the roads, because the unique situation also, just as many other border regions in Burma, was that this area was not really under the control of government. This area is controlled by the National Democratic Army of Kachin. They have a peace agreement, so there's no conflict. But nevertheless, the government doesn't exercise direct control over the area. Likewise, we have suddenly seen, now China is suddenly very close. Iron traps have come across the border, shotguns made in China, and suddenly the subsistence hunting had changed into hunting for wildlife trade into the Chinese market. You see here logging roads on the steepest slopes, sometimes actually even in pure rock faces. The Chinese have dynamited logging roads to get to very rare species of acer and also conifer species such as Taiwana cryptomedia, which is a very famous tree used in coffin making and for rare furnitures. And so causing erosion and causing destruction of habitat, but mostly opening up access for hunting and wildlife trade. And you see what massive trees are up there in this ancient forest that are getting logged. Yeah, this is one of the famous hunters, still hunting with crossbows in those mountain forests. And you see his nice collection of monkey skulls. Mostly these are macaques, but there are some short-ridged langurs among the skulls, and also and one snub-nosed monkey skull that was collected as part of the for the determination of the species, for description of the species. And lots of the other wildlife that is being caught: takin, wild cats, porcupines, red pandas, and then this is for local consumption, deer species and wild pigs, of course, red coral. And this is a juvenile snub-nosed monkey that fell out of a tree because its mother got shot. And so it was a very difficult beginning, where you have very skillful indigenous hunters to turn this around. And so we started initially with a very intensive conservation awareness program, actually starting with the Myanmar snub-nosed monkey, to create a local conservation constituency for the endangered wildlife in the place. And it has been successful, just with sort of creating a local flagship species where people are very clear now that the government can't save the species. Only the people, by not hunting the species and protecting it, can save this newly discovered primate from extinction. And so it has been extraordinarily successful at this stage. And actually the communities themselves declared a community conservation zone in the absence of any government protected area, and declared the whole range of the forest where the Myanmar snub-nosed monkey, the three subpopulations, where they live in large bands. These snub-nosed monkeys, theoretically, if there's no hunting and they have proper population sizes, group sizes, they can have up to 200 individuals in one group, rather than different from like gibbons that live in pairs of two, very different behavior. And since then, we have taken it stepwise further with the reform program of the government. As I mentioned, there's very few protected areas in Myanmar, and this area, obviously, not just for the Myanmar snub-nosed monkey, but all the other endemic species, the rich flora and fauna deserves protected area designation. And so we wanted to make sure that this is fully inclusive with the local communities, and they are part of the process to delineate a core zone of full protection, which becomes the national park boundary, but still with forests around that are used for traditional subsistence hunting and forest product collection. And so we have now the full support also of the Minister of Forestry and Environment of the regional government, and this is now going ahead. We have done the process together with the Forest Department, and we are now in the final decision-making process to gazette this park formally as protected area. Again, doesn't mean law enforcement can happen right away. I mentioned that this area is not fully controlled by government. There's a long way to go, but we are making steady progress. And at least this gives it a legal designation that can at least have a legal aspect of the logging that happens from China. Because there's no Myanmar people involved. All the logging is done by Chinese workers. Even the cook in the camp is Chinese. So this is fully illegal logging in the area, and this is at least we had several meetings already with CITES authorities, with Forest Department of Yunnan, to deal with the status of illegality. And if it's declared a protected area, it's very clear that Chinese companies, at least legally, should not be logging there. And we can take it hopefully a step further and convince the Chinese government to put an end to this disastrous logging. Moving on to the next site we are working, which is one of Southeast Asia's most important wetland. It's probably also, at the moment, one of Myanmar's most important airports for the birds on the flyway between Siberia and Australia. We have more than 20,000 wintering or transiting birds in this lake. And it has, as you can see, both cultural and biodiversity importance. And it just has, it has just been nominated to Ramsar as a globally important wetland. I think next week is the conference that we will hopefully have this going through, that it will be a globally recognized wetland within a few weeks. And we have 1% of a number of flyway populations like this oriental data, so large numbers of globally important water birds. It's a very romantic picture of woolly-necked stork, another endangered species. And this is a resident bird in Myanmar, not migratory, but it's actually breeding in the surrounding wetlands of Indoji Lake, the Sarus crane, very charismatic bird. And of course, likewise, we have serious problems there. They go from small-scale gold mining that leads to pollution and sedimentation in the lake. A lot of firewood extraction, the surrounding unsustainable firewood extraction in the surrounding watershed. And our project, fishing also, unsustainable fishing, I must say, to fishing. Because a lot of the other places, wetlands in Myanmar, have been fished empty. People are very poor, so they're all resource dependent. There has been not this urbanization and industrialization that basically takes people from the countryside into urban centers. So most people live in the countryside, and there is just too many fishermen. Also fishermen that migrated from other places, not indigenous local fishermen. And we have unsustainable fishing practices. So the fish stock in this wetland ecosystem is going down. And fish is really important in this area because we had just Maurice Cottelat, one of the world's leading fish experts, doing a taxonomic study for us in this wetland, and we got 5 new species to science. And it has a very high level of endemism that was already known since British colonial days, but we have added more new species to the list of fish. Very high diversity. Likewise for freshwater turtles, there's the Burmese peacock turtle, a very charismatic turtle in the lake. And so we have first, done the science to improve the protection of the area. We have trained forest rangers, local community members in biological assessments and monitoring, but also established patrol groups with local communities to basically improve law enforcement. We have dealt with some of the major threats, like the watershed destruction, which leads to sedimentation in the lake, by launching a very large firewood-saving stove program. There has been now over 8,000 of these stoves installed. We do training courses. The people build these stoves themselves. You have a photo here in the right corner, which, in the back is boiling the rice. In the front, you can do your stir-fried vegetables or coffee boiling. And likewise, we have started a community forestry program. We are working in more than 25 villages now that have all received community forestry certificates from the government. We have nurseries in all these villages. It creates income for people and reduces these are fast-growing. It's a mixture of natural forest species, but also fast-growing firewood species, so that we reduce the dependency on firewood in the short term. And also creating alternative sources of livelihood for the young generation, so they don't necessarily have to become fishermen. We engage in ecotourism. FFI has introduced kayaking to Myanmar. There has been nobody that provided kayaking. And it was very interesting. People who came before, they only had the choice of a very expensive motorboat to tour through the lake. And so the average stay was 1 to 2 days. The average stay of tourists has now increased to 3 to 4 days. And the numbers have gone up by 100% within 2 years. And this is all done through community-based tourism. We now also have the first homestays that we are supporting at the lake. Before, there was only one government-run hotel. To deal with the problems with unsustainable fisheries, we have worked very intensively with the local fish communities. After the scientific surveys, which identified which areas are important for fish breeding, which areas are important for endemic fish, we then worked with fishermen to develop fish conservation zones and fishing regulations and enforce them. Because if you have these critical areas protected where the fish breed, you actually have spillover, and your fish stock increases and your fisheries becomes more sustainable. And we have also, because the situation was before, the whole lake was an open access, there was no regulation, everybody used everything everywhere, and so we basically created then clear core zones and management plans for this Indoji Lake Wildlife Sanctuary, so that there is actually a legal basis and scientific basis for enforcement. And we are now seeking recognition from Ramsar and from UNESCO as biosphere reserves and as globally important wetland. And the UNESCO nomination will be submitted in September, which is basically a framework to integrate livelihoods with the conservation of biodiversity. And it's mainly through a system of zonation. You see, this is the latest zonation plan through a fully consultative process with all the local communities and stakeholders, where we have strictly protected core zones. You see the green areas. You see the large orange area with the little green dots around it, which is the core zones, is the lake body. And then you have this large mountain around it, like an L shape, which is the important watershed. And all this has just been completed last month and is now being formalized by the government. Now, for terrestrial conservation, the last place I'm going to take you is that area that I mentioned at the very beginning, the south of the country. This incredible rainforest that is left, and the elevation above sea level is just between 1 meter and 50 meters. So it's level lowland forest. That forest doesn't exist anywhere else anymore. And it's extremely rich, and it's very well known for the discovery of this little fellow here, which is the Burmese pitta. And bird watchers would easily pay $100 per person just to take a single camera shot of this bird. It did exist in Thailand. There was a fragment of that rainforest on the Thai side, because this is on the isthmus of Thailand, just north of the peninsula of Malaysia. But it's extinct there. The forest is gone. There's 4 individuals of this bird left. It's doomed to extinction. So Myanmar is now the only hope for the survival of this charismatic species. And I show you also that this is located in a very important large forest corridor. We have here the border between Myanmar and Thailand. This is the isthmus of Thailand, this large peninsula here. You see this large western forest complex. You see a whole range of forests linking all the way up to the south. So this is the largest remaining lowland and hill forest complex in mainland Southeast Asia. And in the south, it has a completely Sundaic fauna. So you have tigers, leopards, elephants, gaur, tapir, banteng, everything that you expect from a proper rainforest in this area. And on the Thai side, there's actually a few national parks adjacent to it. I mean, the real sort of transitional Sundaic area is just down here, but there's corridors for the large mammals to even link with populations in Thailand, or even repopulate some of these areas. There's no more tigers in Koiburi, and I think a single one in Kengkachan that moves across the border. So Myanmar is the last hope to repopulate some of these protected areas in Thailand with endangered species. And there we go. This was the first camera trap photo. We were all very excited, so we went in there, and FFI has done a lot of camera trapping over the years in Southeast Asia. And we had the camera traps only in for the first 2 weeks, and already we got everything that we wanted to see. Not only tigers, but also leopards, tapir, many tapir photos, many elephant photos. A total of 8 cats, things like bay cat, flat-headed cat, clouded leopard, also the black form of this leopard. So everything was complete. And you cannot find this complete assembly of lowland forest species anywhere else anymore. And this is a feature in a recent BBC Wildlife magazine story featuring our primatologist who is working in the area. It's a place also important for primates. This is the dusky langur, a leaf monkey in the southern area. And we are doing DNA work on a number of the primate species in the south to see whether there's any new species still lurking. But it's likewise very important for primates. Also gibbons, white-handed gibbon is very common in this area. But the threats are massive. And what I said, this historic moment was the opening of Myanmar, huge amounts of investment coming in for infrastructure development, for plantation development, for industrial complexes like cement industry. We have interesting limestone complexes with the highest number of bat species in the country in this landscape. So all of this is pouring in, and we have only a few years before we have vested interests that make conservation at a large scale impossible. So now is the time to declare these areas as protected areas, because this is all unprotected. They are only proposed national parks. And oil palm is certainly, from Indonesia and Malaysia, where forests have been completely displaced by oil palm, is now moving northward and encroaching into this incredible lowland forest. And you can see how bad it looks. These are the 2 proposed protected areas here. And you see there's large polygons here. This is already too dry for oil palm, so you see the problems mostly in the south, which was that most important area in the south, because that's this transitional rainforest with this high endemism, with the Burmese pitta, storm stork, other Sundaic species, the highest numbers of tigers and elephants. And so this is completely, except this little bit here, covered in concessions that I've given out, but not converted yet. So I'm very, very happy to report that we have been able to convince the Ministry of Environment and Forestry of the new reform cabinet to cancel these 2 massive concessions here. So they have been cancelled. So we have now the way free to start the protected area process, do it as quickly as possible, but as inclusive as possible, which takes some consultation times. Otherwise, we have to start again from the beginning later. And so you see some threats are still remaining. We have some oil palms that have already encroached in the area we originally proposed here and here. We also got encroachment from Thailand, from the other side of the border. And we have some old villages inside the forest. And also we have recently returning refugees. Because of the long years of conflict and ethnic insurgent armies along the border, in Thailand there's 2.5 million people in refugee camps waiting to go home if there's peace. Now this area has peace because there's a ceasefire agreement between the Karen National Union and the government. And so people start returning into their old villages. And so we have to accommodate that in the process of protected area assessment. It's their right to return to their ancestral land. And so this requires then very intensive consultation with the communities. We map all these old villages, we talk to returning refugees, we consult all the people, we talk to the KNU leadership, the generals that run the KNU. It's also interesting that we have to deal with a dual governance system. So actually the KNU completely controls the area. They do have a forest department, they do have an agriculture department, just as the government. And the government tolerates it that we work with both sides. It took a lot of work to build that trust, that they are not assuming that we are sort of British spies and actually have only conservation in mind. But we have now very good relationships with both sides, and we are making progress, but it's still a rocky path. There are still obstacles that we have to overcome to create a protected area. But we have now mapped over 60 villages surrounding that landscape through participatory land use mapping, customary land mapping, and come up with revised boundaries. This is the park in the north, and here the southernmost areas. That you see, these are old village areas that we are taking out of the park because people have rightful lands there, and even some established plantations, it's too late, the forest is destroyed. Better not to have a conflict inside the park and take these out of the borders. And all the village lands with customary claims have been taken out of the park. So now we have an accepted draft boundary. We are still in the consultation process that is ongoing. We will now have the government facilitate everybody coming to the table again, reviewing those maps and giving prior, and informed consent to the establishment of these parks. Now the last subject I wanted to introduce today is our marine conservation program. Now marine is even worse in terms of knowledge and protected area coverage. There's only one marine national park in Myanmar, and that actually covers an island ecosystem, which is lumpy. It was established not for its coral reefs, but for its wonderful island forest. And so there's no real marine protected area in Myanmar. When we started out, we tried to work with the universities, and then sort of the first that I learned was, there were some great taxonomists actually, some trained by the old British education system. And so, but they couldn't swim. So I said, well, how do you do your coral taxonomy? I said, well, we dredge the reef. I said, oh, well, okay. So destructive sampling, so to speak. But fair enough. I mean, people had no resources, no training, were left alone for so many years, and did try their best with the resources and the possibilities they had to do science. Very dedicated people, very dedicated scientists, and we work with them because they're very good taxonomists. But they didn't want to learn swimming. Most of them were in their 60s. So we had to build a completely new team, and at the time there was not a single, except the Navy had a few divers, but they were not very safe either because we asked them to join our trainings, and some of them quit before the dive training was finished. And so we had to build a new team of young people that all got trained. They're all rescue divers by now. We are now 2 years later when we started the marine program. We got 6 people trained as rescue divers. They are all science divers. They can all do coral identification, invertebrate identification, seaweed identification, so the whole biological survey work. We had lots of people from around the world that helped us scientifically. We had some great scientists from Smithsonian Institute to work with us and train our people. We had some great partners from IUCN and other scientific organizations that helped to build a Burmese team. And so we have now spent 2 years underwater to try to identify what are the conservation priorities for marine areas. And we have this massive archipelago here with hundreds of islands, and all of them have been surveyed now. You see these are all the survey sites, and we then, you can see here, we have looked at sites that have at least coral cover of 40%, and they are also resilient to climate change. Now this is very interesting. Resilience to climate change, you can see if actually, we had a big bleaching event. There was an El Nino in 2010, and a lot of the coral reefs in the Andaman Sea have died. In Thailand, actually, it was almost 95% on the west coast and the Andaman Sea of the corals that died off. Not so, interestingly, because here's Thailand, yeah? So this is a completely open, yeah? They share the same ocean, but the current flow goes this way, from north to south. And interestingly, see, we have the big Tanitari River here because we are having a rich to reefs conservation approach where we had here the Tiger Range, the forested area right here, and here's the mangrove estuaries, and here we have the coral reefs. So interestingly, see here, we found a very high variance in water temperature due to this sort of changes on freshwater influxes and things like that, sedimentation. And so corals over a long period of time in this area have adapted to temperature changes, because their temperature changes can be up to 8 degrees of water temperature. So with other words, these corals, they are more resilient than corals further south. So these reefs, also because of the ocean current, are extremely important to keep the whole system alive. Now the larvae of corals cannot travel very, very long, so you actually have to create a marine protected area network so that corals can re-establish colonies all the way down to Thailand. And Thailand and its marine conservation is actually dependent on Myanmar reefs. Otherwise, they will remain dead. And you can see the only recovery of corals that has happened is the islands right next to the border with Myanmar. And so we will ultimately work on a network of small marine protected areas along the whole island chain, but with limited financial resources. And also in the absence of any marine protected areas present, we have to pilot a few first. So we have decided on the 2 best sites to start a marine conservation program first. And I mean, look at this. This is at low water level. Fantastic coral cover. There where people would walk on the reeflet, you would imagine those acrophora broken and destroyed, but you got fantastic coral cover intact on these islands. And so, and the area is populated by sea gypsies, Moken that roam around, live on boats, and basically use spear guns to go for lobsters, for sea cucumbers, for all sorts of invertebrates, mollusca, and also do fish bombing. And there has been a lot of destructive fishing. And so these people have to be part of the conservation solution. And we are now working with them to establish no-take zone on these coral reefs, develop locally managed marine areas together with these communities. But likewise, we have to deal with the large-scale threats, because Myanmar waters have had massive amount of commercial industrial trawling, both by Thai boats and Myanmar fishing boats, and the whole sea has been fished empty. There was a recent research vessel from Norway that has resurveyed the same waters that they have surveyed 10 years ago. Over 10 years, the stock of fish has dropped by 70%. And the Myanmar coast is heavily populated by local fishermen. They are not the ones that do the damage, of course. And they get less fish and less fish in their nets every day. So poverty is increasing in the coastal zone. And this is not just a biodiversity question, but a very, very important livelihood question to get these fisheries more sustainable. So to deal with the large-scale threats, we have a cooperation with Smithsonian to undertake a pilot program of vessel monitoring system. And this is currently on a voluntary basis, where some of the trawlers, we work very closely with one big trawling captain that has 200 boats under his commando to operate monitoring system where the vessels are at each time so that they don't trawl in the near shore. Because in the near shore is where these trawlers destroy reefs, destroy breeding grounds of fish, and we want to keep them at least to the deep sea, so at least keep 10 miles from the coast as required by Myanmar law. And we have established very good relationships with the Navy, because the Navy one is the only one that has boats. Fisheries Department has no boats, no resources. They cannot undertake any law enforcement. So at the moment, we are hopefully in the next few months buying our first patrol boat to work on this Langan Island on the first marine protected area in the making. And you can see here the sort of conceptual framework where this is discussed with the local sea gypsy community here as these are no-take zones. They're very important reef areas where the breeding of fishes is happening, are completely closed off from any use, but the spillover, of course, into these waters creates a much larger fisheries available to local communities, and this larger marine protected areas as a complete no-go zone for the trawlers and for any kind of large-scale commercial fishing. So this area only for fishing by local artisanal fishers. And with the support of, there's a Navy base right opposite here, with the support of the Navy, we hope to be able to enforce this new MPA. So the Minister of Fisheries has agreed to establish this protected area. So we are now working on the whole consultation process for this zonation, which is not quite completed yet, but we hope to complete it in a few months. And then we will engage in the formal gazettement of these marine protected areas. And finally, a Burmese greetings. Thank you very much, Jesu Timbare from our Burmese Marine team. And I thank you very much for your interest. I hope you have a chance to visit Myanmar. It's certainly a very exciting place. Thank you very much.